The following series is pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. I want to take this time to welcome everybody back to the channel. There will not be a recap for this episode. I encourage everybody to go back and watch this series from the beginning, as this episode is not a good place to start. Once you're all caught up, come back and watch this latest episode. Without further ado, this is If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2005. January 2005. When we last left off, Kurt had spent some time with Courtney Love after a long, estranged relationship with his ex-wife and the mother of their child, Frances Bean. Kurt is trying desperately to maintain a relationship with Courtney to ensure that his daughter has a solid future going forward. The last thing he wants is for Frances to grow up hating one of her parents, much like he did as a child after his parents' divorce. The first days of January start with a small string of Canadian dates, which the band will use as preparation for the upcoming David Letterman performance, in which the band will perform the newly released single, Real Eyes, from Oviparous, which has a music video set to be released one day before the performance to boost viewership. This performance, being great, is more important to Kurt than the entirety of the Canadian dates. The first Canadian date set for the band is in Toronto, Ontario. Nirvana will play a grueling hour-and-a-half setlist on the first show, really solidifying the atmosphere that is to come for the following dates. The next most important date is the Live on Much Music performance, January 7th, 2005. The band will do a sit-down interview with Much Music VJs. During this interview, the band will talk about the struggles they went through just getting to put this album together. Kurt will mention that he hopes he can finish this off and put a nice cap on Nirvana's legacy by the time he's 40. He will be 38 this year. This shows the rest of the band as well as fans watching at home what Kurt's true intentions are. He more or less plans on only having 2 more years of this band. During the event, the band will play a handful of songs, including All Wet Yet Nice, which the band will open with. The first 30 seconds of the performance is just Chris strumming the bass line, which will prove to have been a bad idea later on in the year, due to the bass line being strikingly similar to Megadeth's Symphony of Destruction. The band also plays Rather Say, Dope Sick, and Heart-Shaped Box to close. They purposely left out Real Eyes, with that song intended to be saved for the Letterman performance. The band will finish its Canadian dates in Halifax, Nova Scotia, before heading home to the US to prepare for Letterman, and then their first leg of the European tour in mid-January. The band has a lot on their plate this month. By this point in the new year of 2005, Oviparous is still selling strong. It was greatly benefited by the release of Christmas in Seattle just a month prior, putting more eyes on the band who may not have been aware of Nirvana's newest release back in the summer of 2004. As for the reception of the album itself, the majority of reviews are positive, with 86% approval rating among fans, with only a small portion of fans having negative reviews, many of which claim that Cobain's voice and songwriting abilities are not what they used to be, and nowhere near the strong-willed Nirvana of the early 90s in their heyday. Some fans believe the band should have just stayed broken up, whereas others believe it's a good continuation of the band and brings the band into today's mainstream. The album is nowhere near the success of Nirvana's albums from the 90s, but for the majority of fans, they are just happy to have another album to enjoy. January 12th, 2005. The Real Eyes music video is released on MTV and Much Music, gaining a heavy rotation on Much Music. replacing the Rather Say video as the top Nirvana video on the televised circuit at this time. The video was filmed in the fall of 2004, before the winter started to emerge, and according to Chris Novoselic, quote-unquote, when the sun was still out. January 13th. Nirvana is set to appear on Late Night with David Letterman for the first time ever. David asked specifically for Nirvana to perform, as he was a fan of Dave Grohl and recently shared some kind words about Nirvana's latest release, Oviparous. The day of, during rehearsal, Kurt begins to complain about a sore throat, creating some worry amongst the band, but Kurt's complaint is later shrugged to the side and the band continues to rehearse. The night of the show, the band has arrived fully dressed in suits as if they were ready to attend an expensive dinner party. All but Kurt, who wore one of his signature wool sweaters and looks like he just got out of bed. He didn't even comb his hair, which is now starting to grow back out of the buzz cut phase and more into a standard short hairstyle like it used to be. It's hard to tell if the entire band is actually on the same page with what they want to do. The guys were very excited to meet David Letterman. Kurt initially shook his hand as soon as they walked in the room. The tone changed when the band was told they have to cut the bridge section out of the song to shorten the performance due to time constraints. Kurt would agree to this, but when the performance came to fruition, the band continued to play that section of the song anyway, as if they didn't care what was asked of them. The performance turned out well with a huge spike in viewership for that one segment. At the end of the show, David announces that Nirvana will play the show out during the credits, and the band begins to play Rather Say. The footage of the performance cuts out halfway through the first chorus as the credits roll and the show ends. Nirvana is invited back later in the year, and the band agrees to come back with some new material to perform on the show, quote-unquote, maybe in the summer. Kurt would say, quote-unquote, there's no other way I'd want to spend my summer, he says as a nod to the song from Oviparous. Only he and Chris really pick up on the joke. Due to the terrible winter storm on the horizon, the second leg of the European tour is rescheduled for early February. Kurt thought it was silly and didn't want to prolong the tour if he didn't have to, stating, quote-unquote, this wouldn't be my first time stuck on an airplane in the snow. Although, the rest of the band wishes to postpone the dates so they don't have to fly in terrible conditions. Missing these dates, however, opened up new doors. Nirvana was previously asked to play a date of the Big Day Out Festival in 2005 in Australia. Previously, they were unable to attend this gig due to their upcoming European tour. But with the postponed dates, it opened up new opportunities. Nirvana embarked on the journey 2 days before the date so they could enjoy the area. Nirvana plays a non-headlining spot, Sunday, January 23rd, at Big Day Out 2005. They played for 51 minutes before destroying the stage and leaving. The rest of January consists of the band preparing to embark on their European tour for 2005. Kurt still holds some reservations about embarking on another full-scale tour. The previous American tour in the tail end of 2004 didn't really go over as planned, but it is still beneficial. He knows it's the best possible thing he can do right now, for the band, for his daughter's future, and for his mental health. He knows he has to get back in the saddle before he can inevitably ride off into the sunset again. February 2005. The band is preparing to go overseas to play the first leg of the European tour. But with the winter storm postponing the dates, the first and second leg of the tour get pushed together, creating one giant European tour. There will be no 2 weeks off in between as previously scheduled. This will create a rift in the band that wasn't there before. Kurt doesn't like the thought of it, but knows that once it's done, it's done. The band will initially fly to the UK in the first week of February to kick off the tour, playing grueling 2-hour shows day after day across the continent. with only 1 or 2 days off between some of those. Most of the shows, however, take place on back-to-back days, giving the band little to no time to prepare for their next travel. While sitting by himself in a rental van outside of the venue one night, Kurt writes a new song on his Telecaster. He will later title this song Mayflowers. On Kurt's 38th birthday, Courtney Love and Francis fly out to see Nirvana play in Warsaw, Poland. Francis being there really boosted Kurt's mood. As the shows went on, Kurt was increasingly more visibly uncomfortable, until Francis would show up and give Kurt some much-needed R&R with his family. Courtney, on the other hand, wasn't as welcome, and the general consensus of the band was, why is she here? But to maintain a good environment with Kurt, nobody brings it up to him. Courtney stays and travels with the band up until right after Valentine's Day, where he and Francis will fly home and let the band continue on with the rest of the tour. Chris, Dave, and Pat are unsure of what went down, leaving them wondering if Kurt and Courtney are getting back together, or if they have been already. Due to the postponed shows, the band will play in Europe all through February, playing their last show in London, England, February 27th, 2005. During this show, the band would abruptly stop playing as the power went out due to another snowstorm. Some sources say PJ Harvey was at the show, but neglected to talk to Kurt or any of the band members. It's just a rumor spread by fans at this point. The tour proved to be grueling, but pretty much everyone involved is just happy, but also surprised that Kurt was able to make it all the way through the tour. Even Kurt himself. March 2005. Upon arriving home to the U.S., Kurt is contacted by Nirvana's current tour manager, who informs Kurt that the tour went very well, with the band gaining a good percentage of revenue, with this being Nirvana's most successful European tour of all time. Oviparous is still selling, but calming down compared to the previous sales around the holiday season of 2004. The tour manager also informs Kurt that he has heard from Megadeth's current PR manager and that Dave Mustain, lead singer, songwriter of Megadeth, would like to speak with Kurt personally. Kurt is dumbfounded by this news. He thinks to himself, why Dave Mustain? What do Nirvana and Megadeth have in common? The answer, however, is Dave believed Nirvana ripped off Megadeth with the all wet yet nice bass line, and would like to discuss a potential settlement. This is the last thing Kurt wanted to hear upon arriving home from Europe. Instead of dealing with this situation immediately, Kurt gets into contact with Paul McCartney and begins discussing more ideas for a Nirvana box set that can be released on Sellout Records, potentially sometime this year, to generate more sales and revenue for Kurt and the band. By the end of March, Kurt gets into contact with Dave Mustain's attorney and sets up a date for the two to meet. Kurt thinks this is stupid, but takes solace in the fact that Dave would rather meet Kurt face to face than to have their attorneys get involved and make the entire situation more complicated. Kurt spends the weekend at Courtney's house, where Francis has actively been staying while Kurt was off fulfilling his tour obligations with Nirvana. In the end of the month, Dave Grohl and Taylor Hawkins have actively started writing new music and recording demos to what will eventually be a new album. Pat Smear would later join in on the session, stating, quote-unquote, "It was all in good fun. Doesn't mean Nirvana is done, and Nirvana doesn't mean Foo Fighters is done. It's just all in the name of music. We just have a great time, no matter what band it is." April 2005. On April 5th, 2005, what will end up being the final single from Oviparous is released. The single in question is Dope Sick, a song directed at PJ Harvey. A music video is released. It does not feature the band. The music video is simply just a time-lapse video of cigarette butts being put out in an ashtray. When the video starts, the ashtray is empty, and by the end of the video, the ashtray is full and overflowing. 2 more singles are planned for the remainder of 2005, but later in the year they will be canceled due to personal reasons on Kurt's behalf. On April 15th, Kurt finally meets with Dave Mustain of Megadeth in Los Angeles. The two hit it off pretty well in the beginning, with Kurt and Dave seemingly sharing a lot of the same interests in bands. They also bond over their dislike of Lars Ulrich from Metallica, who Kurt sees as a selfish guy. They get to talking about Dave's new upcoming Megadeth album, The System Has Failed, which was originally intended to be his first solo project. Instead, he decided to keep calling it Megadeth. Dave then brings up the all wet yet nice bass line issue and shows Kurt a clip of Symphony of Destruction and their similarities. Kurt explains that he can hear the similarities but isn't sure if it should result in any form of lawsuit. Dave continues on about it and explains that it's the principle and doesn't want to get lawyers involved. They decide to settle it out of court to maintain a good relationship and keep it civil. But Dave feels like he's owed something for the riff, to which Kurt scoffs, but ultimately agreed, just to get past this and move along with his life. The two exchange numbers so they can talk to each other directly, rather than get lawyers and management involved. Kurt goes home later that night and is greeted by Michael Stipe, sitting and waiting inside Kurt's house. Michael had received a key to the studio from Kurt all the way back in 1997. He had used it to get in. Michael knew he was always welcome in Kurt's home and didn't even ask if Kurt was around so he could drop by. He figured he'd just come by and wait. He knew Kurt would eventually show up, even if it means sleeping there for the night while he waits. Kurt walks in the house with a huge smile on his face, happy to see Michael. The two stay up all night talking and reminiscing about the old days. They talk about REM, as well as Nirvana's latest ventures. Michael tells Kurt he's happy that he was able to get his life in order enough to get the band back together. They also talk about Courtney, and Michael explains to Kurt that he isn't quite sure if it's the best idea to associate himself with his ex-wife. But he sees the benefit it would have for Frances Bean. And whatever Kurt thinks is a good idea, Michael will gladly go along with it. They begin to discuss the idea of a follow-up Relevant album, to which Kurt boldly tells Michael that he has no desire to work with Mark Lanegan again. Not for any personal reasons based on Mark's personality, but only because he knows Mark is still into drugs at this time in this particular timeline. He just doesn't want to be associated with it. He also wasn't too fond of the reception Relevant got, and the album as a whole was an afterthought to him and his entire fan base. He appreciates all it did for helping get Sellout Records off the ground, but he feels like he got sidelined in favor of Mark's ideas, even if that's what he stated he wanted at the time. Kurt does, however, agree to work on some music with Stipe. He doesn't want to sit behind a drum set and whisper like he did last time. He wants to play guitar and sing and write songs with Stipe. This is something entirely new. He wants to try new things with new instruments. He talks about having saxophone and keyboards in these songs, and how he wants it to be mainly acoustic with different sets of drummers and bass players. Michael stops Kurt in his tracks and says, quote unquote, "Let's take it one thing at a time." He knew Kurt was just thinking big, maybe too big for the time. Nirvana had a triumphant return less than a year before this moment. Michael doesn't want Kurt to push it aside to do something else, but they do go downstairs and start working out some new melodies together. April 30th. A fan takes a photo of Courtney Love and Frances Bean walking down the street with an unidentified man in a ski mask disguise. It's presumably Cobain, based on his well-known physical appearance. It's circulated online with many fans saying that it's definitely Kurt, and that he doesn't want to be seen with Courtney in public, and that he's merely maintaining his fatherhood status. What the fans don't actually know is that Kurt and Courtney have actively been attempting to reform their relationship. May 2005. On May 2nd, Kurt is once again contacted by Nirvana's tour manager. This time, he's calling to inform Kurt that Nirvana has been offered one of the 3 headline spots at the 2005 Reading and Leeds Festival in late August. Kurt initially shrugs the idea off and tells the tour manager that he's been working on something else and needs time to finish before he wants to go play any more shows. At this time, we have to remember that Kurt hasn't spoken to any of the other band members of Nirvana since they came back from their month-long European tour 2 months ago. So none of this information is known to anybody. Kurt is informed that Pixies will be the act before Nirvana, with Nirvana being the headlining act. Upon hearing Pixies playing, Kurt is immediately more interested, but says he'll only agree to play the show if Nirvana opens for Pixies. The tour manager says, quote unquote, "I'll see what we can work out," and Kurt immediately calls Chris to tell him the news. It will later be revealed that Dave Grohl was also asked to headline Reading and Leeds Festival with Foo Fighters on separate dates. May 17th, 2005. Michael Stipe visits Kurt once again, this time bringing over CDs which contained isolated vocal melodies that he had come up with, to which Kurt would play some guitar over while they work out some new material. May 19th, 2005. Kurt speaks with Dave and Pat and works out the details for Reading Festival. Paul McCartney is present, essentially trying to work out the best deal possible for Kurt, considering Pat and Dave will be playing twice and getting paid twice as much, after everyone comes to an agreement. The biggest issue the band will run into is the fact that Reading and Leeds 2005 took place across 2 different festival grounds spanning 3 days on a weekend. The first set of shows in which the Pixies headline takes place on Friday and Saturday. The issue being, the show Foo Fighters is scheduled to headline takes place on the same days at a different festival ground. How is it possible for Nirvana and Foo Fighters to play on 2 different festival grounds when 2 of the members are in both bands? They may run into a roadblock trying to figure out how they're going to manage that. It is discussed that Nirvana can get switched over to the same location as Foo Fighters, but Dave is unwilling to give up his headline spot. And Kurt doesn't think it's a good idea to have both bands play on the same show. After much deliberation between members of Nirvana and Foo Fighters, it's decided that there is no way Dave and Pat would be able to play both shows at the same time. The only compromise would be for both bands to play the same show, which is out of the question. Kurt will only do this show because of the fact that he gets to open for Pixies. Dave decides he will gladly find a replacement drummer to join Nirvana for the performance, something that Kurt isn't entirely against, although Chris doesn't like the idea of it. He feels that without Dave, it's not really Nirvana anymore at this point. As much as Nirvana is Kurt's band, the legacy they have built for the past decade includes Dave Grohl as the drummer. And we can't forget that without Dave going off to do Foo Fighters in the years that Kurt remained absent from the public eye, Nirvana might not be as big as they are now without Dave becoming a massive success in his own right. All it did was bring more eyes to Nirvana when they returned by having Dave Grohl involved. Kurt explains he really just wants to open for Pixies and doesn't care what they decide to do, but tells everyone he's doing it either way. This pretty much confirms that they will have to find a replacement drummer one way or the other. The next person in question, though, is Pat Smear. What band will he choose? He's also in Foo Fighters and Nirvana. If Pat gives up the headlining spot in Foo Fighters to play a lower spot on the card, he may lose out on a bigger payout. Everyone realizes the magnitude of the situation and nobody is budging. Both bands are absolutely going to play their designated spots. Nobody is going to put the other band aside. Both bands are important in their own right. Paul McCartney chimes in and tells everyone that he wouldn't mind stepping in for Pat to play as the rhythm guitarist for Nirvana for the festival. Always inserted the idea of him joining the band, even back to when Kurt first met Paul. It was always sort of a running joke between them. Kurt thinks it's a silly idea, but at the same time knows the eyes will be on Paul and not him. so he agrees to let Paul join Nirvana, for one time only. All members of both bands come to agreement this is the first time that the band will technically separate, but there is no animosity at this time. Nirvana isn't breaking up. Dave and Pat didn't outright leave the band. This is a one-time deal, and everyone is expected to go back to normal after this is done. Kurt neglects to book any practices or rehearsals with Chris and Paul for the rest of May, and a replacement drummer is also yet to be determined for the rest of the month, while Foo Fighters are consistently working on a new album. By the end of May, Kurt and Courtney have been spending more time together. Having an older, more mature Frances around is beneficial. She almost acts as a mediator to keep them from getting a bite out of each other. Kurt knows who Courtney is, and he knows what he doesn't like about her. Courtney knows what she doesn't like about Kurt. But they came to a point in their lives where they had to take a step back and look at their lives. And the first thing that pops into both of their minds is their daughter. It's for her. It is not for them. June 2005. Kurt continues writing songs with Michael Stipe. He even shows him a new song he's been working on. He doesn't say whether it was intended for Nirvana or for something else, but he called the song Mayflowers. Michael initially loves the song but tells Kurt maybe he should keep that one for himself. Kurt would ask Michael if he has ever met Paul McCartney, to which Stipe responds, quote unquote, "I've met him in passing, but I've never been a Beatles fan." He would later refer to the Beatles as elevator music. Kurt laughs about it and invited Paul over to, quote unquote, teach him some Nirvana songs. 2 nights later, Stipe and McCartney both arrive at Kurt's house separately. The three of them jam some songs together, and Kurt talks about the upcoming Reading Festival and finding a new drummer, which Kurt seemed oddly excited about. He also tells stories of his trip to Australia a few months back when Nirvana played Big Day Out. It looks to Stipe and McCartney that Kurt is actually enjoying himself for once. He seems generally happy with the band and the direction it took since the release of Oviparous. And he's noticeably more happy knowing he made it through the entire tour. Michael says to Kurt, quote unquote, "You're still relevant. We all are." Kurt jokes and says they should start a new project called Still Relevant, with Paul, Kurt, and Michael all contributing musically. Stipe laughs and says, quote unquote, "I love the idea of it, but Mark wouldn't like that. Maybe we can come up with a better name." The night goes on into the early hours of the morning, and it's not official that the three will start a new project together. It was more so just a joke from Kurt. By the end of June, Kurt starts actively contacting Chris Novoselic to prepare themselves to play Reading Festival, which is a far cry from the last time the band played the Reading Festival, well over a decade ago in 1992. Back then, Nirvana played the show without even practicing. This is a new Nirvana. They are definitely going to get in shape for this, especially with being the opening act for Pixies, which is something that excites Kurt the most. The idea of a different drummer also intrigues Kurt. Some say he seemed more enthusiastic about that than anything else. Not that he has any ill will towards Dave. He still sees Dave as one of his best friends. Something about jamming with a new drummer just brings a breath of fresh air into the band for Kurt. The real question is, who could replace Dave? Kurt mentions Paddy Schemmel, former Hole drummer, and also Kurt Cobain's former drummer from his solo album, Christotomy, in 1999-2000. The idea is scrapped after Kurt and Chris both agree that Paddy probably wouldn't be able to keep up with Dave's previous drum style. A few other names are floated around, but nothing stuck. Kurt and Chris have the final say. Dave says he will assist in the search, but hasn't contacted either of them since the last time they had all met. Kurt also feels weird about Paul coming in as the second guitar player for the festival. He knows Paul very well at this point and expects Paul to try and insert himself in Kurt's business at every chance he gets, But Kurt knows if he lets Paul join the band now, he never has to do it again after this, and Paul will finally shut up and will stop asking about it. Kurt has no problem making new music with Paul, but for Nirvana, it is more or less off limits. This is one time only. Foo Fighters have completed recording an entire album in the time between Nirvana's shows. Kurt has been actively writing new music at home, coming up with melodies and guitar riffs, and recording them in his basement to listen back to later. Some of these recordings feature Francis Bean on vocals. July 2005. Nirvana's manager contacts Kurt Cobain to inform him of an incoming plagiarism lawsuit from Van Halen's management company. The song in question is Dope Sick. He explains that parts of the vocal melody in the verse of Dope Sick sound too similar to parts of the bridge in Finish What You Started by Van Halen, and that Eddie Van Halen himself heard the song due to the previously released Dope Sick music video, which was accompanied by a single. Kurt tells the manager to just solve the problem, and if he gets sued again, don't bother calling, just deal with the problem. This gets Kurt to overthink his future single releases and says, quote unquote, I already got sued for 2 of the songs on Oviparous. What else did I rip off? Kurt, not wanting to get sued again, and in a spiteful move, cancels the My Summer single that was scheduled to be released in August. Full cover artwork and copies of the disc do exist, although it is never released to the public and is highly sought after by traders for years to come, much like the Pennyroyal Tea single in our real timeline. Largely due to the fact that it contained an unreleased song from Oviparous, the track list would contain My Summer, a single from Oviparous, an unreleased Oviparous song titled In a Garden, a 2-minute throwaway track that was thrown off the album very early on in the recording process, and So Unsightly, another single from Oviparous. In a Garden would later circulate online for everyone to download for free. Fans would also begin making their own copies of the My Summer single. On July 12th, Foo Fighters released their newest album, In Your Honor, 1 month after it would release in our real timeline, just in time before their headline spot at Reading and Leeds 2005. Nirvana, however, still running off the success of Oviparous, which released 1 month shy of a year ago, is taking a different route. They aren't headlining. Kurt elected to open for the Pixies, which was a bold move in the eyes of many fans, but it is something that Kurt is admired for later. Kurt also canceled the band's Summer EP. The question still remains who the replacement drummer could be. They still have just under 2 months before the festival begins. Chris Novoselic starts to actively accept audition applications all across the United States. By the end of July, Kurt has actively written and recorded a handful of new songs at home, by himself, and also with Michael Stipe. Frances Bean has been spending more time around her father lately, now that Kurt and Courtney are on much better terms than they were previously. She's also been working on her guitar playing and singing, taking after both of her parents. August 2005. The month begins with Chris scrambling to find a replacement drummer in time to practice for the 2 upcoming shows at Reading and Leeds Festival at the end of the month. A close friend of the band had suggested Ray Washam, drummer for the band Scratch Acid and Butthole Surfers, among many other bands. He's available, and he's more than willing to play a set list with the band. Chris gives Ray a call, and a meeting is scheduled for them all to meet at Kurt's place on August 7th, only a few weeks before the festival. Foo Fighters, on the other hand, has actively been playing small strings of shows in the United States to support their new album, In Your Honor. Dave hasn't contacted Chris or Kurt to aid in the search for a replacement drummer, but it's clear to everyone he's busy with his own band at this time. Kurt is still excited about the idea of practicing with a different drummer. August 7th. Kurt and Chris meet with Ray, and they hit it off immediately. Scratch Acid is a very well-known band. Formed in 1982, they are the pioneers of noise rock. Kurt was already a fan and was familiar with Ray's work. Kurt, Chris, and Ray jam old Nirvana songs throughout the day, mainly cranking out the old classics to nail the idea of a set list down, before moving on to more recent material. Ray seems like a natural fit, and he's a fan of the band and already knows the songs. It seems as if the search is over. Chris brings up Paul and asks if he's going to come rehearse with Ray in the following weeks, to which Kurt replies, quote unquote, "Paul can definitely play any of the songs. But yeah, he'll be around." On August 15th, Kurt, Chris, Paul, and Ray get together for the first official band rehearsal as this new version of Nirvana. Francis is present. Kurt really likes jamming with Ray, and it's not a knock on Dave. It's just a good fit, and Kurt already respects Ray's previous works. Although at this time, Kurt does see Dave Grohl as just a bit of a sellout, but that doesn't mean they aren't still friends. Kurt also knows in the back of his mind that Paul McCartney will never officially join Nirvana, and this is only a one-time deal. They aren't even going to announce that he's there. Fans in attendance will get the shock of a lifetime when they see Paul McCartney on the stage with Nirvana. Chris Novoselic makes the joke that they should let Paul sing and change the name to Sirvana, as a reference to Paul being knighted as Sir Paul McCartney in March of 1997. They all laugh, but it's thrown away as a joke. That's definitely not going to happen on Kurt's watch. Kurt shows the rest of the band a song he wrote called Mayflowers, and they jam on it. In the midst of all of this, Nirvana has paid out undisclosed amount of money to Megadeth and Van Halen respectfully. And in the background business side of things, Sellout Records hires a new executive vice president to take the reins from Kurt exclusively to make the business side of things go smoother, so Kurt can focus on his music and art. Kurt gave this new vice president the reins to say yes or no to anything, more or less, so he doesn't have to get involved. In the first major move by the company, Sellout signs the agreement to officially greenlight the release of the upcoming Nirvana box set. The box set is set to include old demo recordings ranging from 1988 to 2004, as well as outtakes, B-sides, alternate takes, and live performances ranging from the very beginning to the present day. At this time, Sellout Records also files to become its own parent company and move away from Capitol Records. The filing alone will take months, but it is put into motion in the summer of 2005. August 26th. The night before Foo Fighters play their first performance, Pat Smear announces that he will not be able to make the festival dates due to a family matter. Pat Smear does not appear at Reading and Leeds Festival, 2005. The first Nirvana Pixies show takes place in Reading, with Tomorrow Night's show taking place in Leeds. Tomorrow's show in Reading, however, will feature Foo Fighters opposite Pixies, who will be playing in Leeds. Kurt and Chris spend most of the time backstage with the other bands in their crew. Paul McCartney doesn't show up until a half hour before set time, but none of the guys are worried. The atmosphere is great. The entire thing is being filmed. It finally dawns on Kurt that wherever this footage ends up, it's going to contain a very different looking Nirvana. The Killers play before Nirvana, and Queens of the Stone Age play before them, among many other bands earlier in that day. It's unfortunate that Pat couldn't make it to the festival or even take his spot back in Nirvana, but he's not upset by any means. Family matters more to him. When Nirvana finally takes the stage, there is a flag hanging in the background that says, Sirvana. Nirvana plays a 18-song set with a large mixture of new and old songs ranging from Bleach to Oviparous. It is more of a greatest hits type of set list, seeing all the big name songs with a nice mixture of rare material. The set list is as follows. Noise intro into All Wet Yet Nice, Drain You, Breed, Realize, Rather Say, School, Serve the Servants, Come As You Are, Dope Sick, Lithium, Smells Like Teen Spirit, an improv jam version of Mayflowers, My Summer, About a Girl, She Said, Beatles cover, a Paul McCartney guitar jam. The entire band follows Paul's lead on this catchy little 2-minute improv jam. Heart-shaped box, and all apologies. Instead of playing an encore, Nirvana just makes a bunch of noise and walks off the stage. The second night in Leeds would have the same set list with a few minor changes. Replace the Mayflowers jam with Teenage Kicks and remove the Paul guitar jam. Paul did exceptionally well during the performance. He knew all the songs like the back of his hand, and his live guitar tone really changed the way the band sounds. The same really went for Ray Washam. It sounded perfect. The boomy effects of the stage really put the drums in your face during the performance. And Kurt nailed it too. He was on point, and he looked more than happy to be there. A collection of this show will be put together as a CD and DVD collection in 2006. It will feature the better performances of each song from both shows, and will also feature both Teenage Kicks and Mayflowers. It'll go down in history as one of the strangest Nirvana shows ever because of the odd lineup. But it will also go on to be considered one of the best. Kurt feels that this show really made Nirvana look like a dad rock band. Kurt hangs out with the members of the Pixies and Queens of the Stone Age all night, as well as members of the Killers, who were huge fans of Nirvana. It's a shame we didn't get to see Nirvana and Foo Fighters on the same night, with all members of Nirvana being present for the performance. That would have truly been a sight to see. But we can also be thankful that in 2005, Nirvana successfully played an entire European tour which lasted one straight month, as well as playing the Big Day Out Festival in Australia, really doing the best they can to sell Oviparous all across the globe. This was a huge and overly successful year for Nirvana, no matter how you look at it. Nirvana is big again, and people want to hear more. But will these newly found change in personnel change the course of the future of the band? Or will things go back to the way they were at the beginning of the year? MTV Video Music Awards take place the night after Nirvana's performance at Reading and Leeds. Nirvana is nominated for Best Rock Video for Realize, but the band does not win, and they are not present at the awards. They aren't mentioned again other than being nominated for that one award. September 2005. Reading and Leeds was a huge success for Kurt and Nirvana, even if it's not the actual full band. Paul McCartney was nothing short of grateful to be allowed to finally join the band like he's been talking about for the past few years, and he tells Kurt he owes him big. Kurt explains to Paul that the show wouldn't have happened without him, and he thanks him as well. Kurt hears from Pat Smear, who tells him, quote unquote, "You might as well just replace me with Paul." They both laughed and talked about life, and it was pretty obvious that Kurt still sees Pat as a full-time member of Nirvana. More discussions take place involving the upcoming Nirvana box set that Sellout hopes to have available to the public sometime in 2006. They are still discussing ideas for what the box set could be called, as well as which tracks will be included and who is going to be the one to sift through the bulk of the material to pick out the best stuff. Kurt would really be the only one, but would he care enough to spend that much time on something he more or less doesn't care about? The box set was Paul's idea, and Sellout is running with it. To Kurt himself, it's an afterthought, but a major part of him knows that it will be the most financially beneficial project he has been a part of since the creation of Sellout Records in 1997. So he agrees to be the one to handpick the tracks on the box set. He also involves Chris Novoselic. It's only right. A few days after the festival, Kurt receives a call from Dave Grohl and they talk about the shows. They didn't talk about Nirvana once. They only talked about the overall experience and atmosphere of the festival, and not of the musical aspect of it. Kurt spent all month taking a break away from playing. The only member of Nirvana Kurt has really spoken to is Chris Novoselic. Ray Washam said thank you to all the members of the band and parted ways after the Reading and Leeds festival. Even he knew it was a one-time deal, but he was more than willing to come back and do it again, to which Kurt agreed. He held his own during the time he spent with the band. As for Paul McCartney, Kurt is still business partners with him. Kurt and Paul have a date set to record some songs with Michael Stipe in October. But as for Paul's time in Nirvana, it's over. It was a one-time deal. It was an iconic performance that will be remembered for a very long time, but nothing more will come from it. October 2005. On October 7th, Kurt gets together with Michael Stipe once again to record some demos. Paul would arrive hours later and add some of his own ideas into the mix. For the most part, Kurt would add the drums in himself, but elected to give Ray Washam a call, who Paul is now familiar with from the Reading and Leeds show just a few months prior. They make a date for everyone to get together and record some demos at Kurt's place. By mid-October, Kurt is still considering selling his house, not because he wants to leave, but now he's starting to think he could benefit from a bigger studio. Kurt begins looking through the old Nirvana demos and outtakes spanning almost 2 decades. He's now actively working hands-on with this new box set. Chris Novoselic joins Kurt on some occasions, but for the most part, Chris would listen to half of the masters at home, and Kurt would listen to the other half, and they would put their favorites into a folder and email them back and forth. By the end of October, Nirvana has been on an unspoken hiatus. Nobody has talked about it, but everyone feels great about how well 2005 went for the band, and that the band is remaining relevant off the lifespan of Oviparous, released over a year ago at this point. With much thanks to the very successful European tour at the beginning of 2005, which saw the album receive a 0.25% boost of its sales 6 months after it was released. Oviparous did well for casual fans. The songs did well on the radio, but old school fans of Nirvana's heyday might not like it as much, with a 46% average of returning listeners, meaning that 54% of the people who made Oviparous a success were new listeners of the time period. It was only after Oviparous released that we started to see another boost in older album sales, In Utero and Nevermind in particular. And now with Kurt and Sellout as well as Paul McCartney Company owning the right to Nirvana's music, it's made him a very wealthy man. Kurt is happy, his daughter is happy, and most of all, it seems as if his life is getting back on track, even if Courtney is lingering around in the background. November 2005. In early November, Kurt gets together with Ray Washam once again and records 3 demos of guitar and drum songs, no bass, and faint vocals, just enough to hear the melody. Kurt just liked jamming with Ray. He was a cool guy and he admired Kurt's style. It was mutual. In Kurt's eyes, Ray is a pioneer and a legend. One of the songs they record is Mayflowers. The other 2 are unknown Kurt riffs, but they are put enough together that you could tell Kurt worked on these songs. They were not just throwaway improv songs. Kurt would begin to show Ray some of the songs Michael and Paul recorded. Ray throws down some rough drum tracks on these new project demos. As for the actual music that was recorded, it's different. It's very much a mix of all three men. It's very poppy, almost like a weird 1980s fever dream Paul McCartney power pop album mixed with REM and Nirvana. But it totally makes sense when you hear it. Kurt sings and plays guitar. They all do. At times, it sounds like a barbershop quartet mixed with Alice in Chains, if Alice in Chains was a pop band. Kurt wants to add saxophones and keyboards and different types of instruments to it. He's been talking about this for a while, but Michael Stipe has been keeping the peace in the mixing room and trying to leave it as radio-friendly as possible. Ray is no stranger to odd bands, and he really likes the idea of this project. Nirvana hasn't played a show since late August, and the original lineup of Nirvana hasn't played a show since late February 2005. But even with that fact, 2005 has still been Kurt's most profitable year, maybe ever, in his career. Later in the month, Kurt does a photo shoot for Sellout Records. In these photos, he has a shorter hairstyle, but it is combed nicely for this photo. He's also wearing an unkempt suit with a name tag that says, The Boss. He's visibly looking older now. He's 38 years old. His previous drug use is starting to show its true colors on his face. But the fact that he was able to overcome his hard drug addictions over a decade ago, he's doing better than one would think. He hasn't touched any kind of pills or other drugs all year, although he still smokes weed and cigarettes. The hard drugs are gone from his system. Sellout spends $10 million on a marketing campaign to create advertisements to get rock bands to send their demo tapes, enticing local rock bands from across the country to test their luck for a record contract with Sellout Records. In these ads, which consist of billboards across different cities in the U.S. that say, The Boss Wants You, with pictures of Kurt's newly taken suit photos. There has also been ads on Much Music and MTV with old clips of Nirvana destroying their instruments, asking viewers if they ever wanted to be big sellout rock stars like Nirvana, and then tells viewers to send their tapes and CDs to a specific address to try their luck on a record contract. The commercial ends with, The Boss Wants You. Kurt is hoping that this new business plan will revitalize rock music in the mainstream and help out smaller bands much like Sub Pop did in the late 80s and early 90s. December 2005. Kurt and Dave talk over the phone for a while about Dave's recent tour for the previously released In Your Honor. He explains to Kurt that he's going out on another tour, but will be back to work on some new Nirvana stuff when he gets back, to which Kurt tells Dave, Don't worry about it right now. I'm working on some stuff with Paul. Dave tells Kurt, quote unquote, Oh, that's cool, man. Yeah, that's awesome. Kurt has no intentions on playing any more shows with Nirvana at this very moment and tells Dave to go off and enjoy his success with Foo Fighters. Kurt is merely just busy with Sellout in the box set, which is going very slowly for Chris and Kurt. There's a lot of stuff to go through, with a lot of stuff Kurt thinks is garbage. We have to remember that when With the Lights Out was conceived and released, Kurt Cobain was dead in our real timeline, and he had no say in what was included on the box set. This time around, I find it hard to believe Kurt would release any of his old bedroom acoustic demos, so the selection on this box set will be very different. It also won't be called With the Lights Out in this timeline. Kurt would never call it that. In this timeline, however, the name is still up in the air at this point, with only about 10% of the material listened to actually being chosen for a release. Before the call with Dave ends, Kurt mentions, quote unquote, "Hey, Dave Letterman never called us back about that other show." To which Dave responds with, "Oh yeah, fuck that guy." Kurt spends the rest of the month off. He hangs out at home drawing weird cartoons in a sketchbook, to which he describes as children's books of the new millennium. Frances Bean has been getting good at writing songs and playing guitar for being only 13 years old. Her dad sees her as the world's next big rock star. 2005 ends with Kurt writing a brand new song on New Year's Eve. He calls the song Young. This will conclude If Kurt Cobain Lived 2005. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this series this far. And please stay tuned for If Kurt Cobain Lived 2006.